Good morning. Our scripture reading is again from the book of Galatians. It's from chapter 5, verses 13 through 26. My siblings, you were called to freedom, but be careful, or this freedom will provide an opening for self-indulgence. Rather, serve one another in works of love, since the whole of the law is summarized in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you go on snapping at one another and tearing each other to pieces, be careful, or you may end up destroying the whole community. Let me put it this way. If you are guided by the Spirit, you will be in no danger of yielding to self-indulgence. Since our flesh is at odds with the Spirit, and the Spirit with our flesh, the two are so opposed that you cannot do whatever you feel like doing. If you're guided by the Spirit, you are not under the law. It's obvious what proceeds from the flesh: lewd conduct, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, arguments, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish rivalries, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, orgies, and so forth. I warn you, as I have warned you before, those who do these sorts of things won't inherit the kingdom of God. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patient endurance, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against these sorts of things, there is no law. Those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified their ego with its passions and desires. So since we live by the Spirit, let us follow her lead. We must stop being conceited, contentious, and envious. These are ancient words for our present contemplation.
Thank you, Carol. Well, we're looking at Galatians for the next month or so as a way of realizing that it's okay to be progressive, that it's okay to be open-minded, that it's okay not to take the Bible literally, not to be legalistic. We're looking at how in the early church that was very, very important. So Galatians, as we've been saying, was written as a response to a kind of regression in an early church where Paul had taught freedom, open-mindedness, a call to love, and other people, fundamentalists, came in and called people back, frightened them, and said, you have to get back to the roots of things, the law, circumcision, this kind of thing. A lot of that doesn't really make any sense in the modern mind, but I think that the issue that Paul is dealing with is something that is very current, that a lot of the dynamics that were happening in this early church are still happening in our country. In fact, I think you probably noticed, like in many ways, our culture is unraveling. And it's, for many people, it's a very frightening time. In my life, there's never been a situation where national leaders who lost an election would then question the democratic process itself and call for an overturning of a democratic election. I've never in my lifetime seen people who dismiss science, who weren't like in some cult or some just strange group of people, but to have a sizable minority of the country that doesn't listen to science. If it can find something that confirms its ideas online, then in 30 minutes, people feel like they've gone beyond, 20 years of scientific study of a professional. And this thing with conspiracy theories, where it's okay to tell these horrible, horrible rumors about people with no evidence, no proof whatsoever, and to feel like that's okay to pass along, these horrific rumors about someone. We used to call that lying, but in our time, so much of the culture is unraveling, and that's a very similar situation to what Paul is going through here. The great empires of the world are shifting, and so the cultures are paying the price tag of that. And I think Paul is pointing a way to hope that may be very relevant to us. Paul, I believe, loved the Stoics, and that may be coming out of right field to you, but the words that Paul is going to use here were very popular in the Stoic community. In Acts, it says that Paul looked up the Stoics to find them and have conversations with them. That doesn't surprise me at all, because he uses words that are very rich in the Stoic tradition. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I think it changes how we hear this passage. I think the passage is much deeper than it may seem as we first look at it. If you wanted to put Stoicism in a nutshell, I think it's that credo: God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. That's really good for AA, but it was something that the Stoics were saying thousands and thousands of years ago. And what Paul's going to do, he's got a real problem, because fundamentalism is a very natural human response when the world changes too fast. When in our own country, when internationalism becomes something that you just got to accept, then it's very natural that fundamentalism would kick in and say, no, you've got to focus on your own nation, America first. Forget world peace, forget all, the world justice. Just take care of our own nation. It's very natural when we have to choose between capitalism and democracy, which I think we are having to make that decision. Will we make our decisions by one person, one vote, or $1, one vote? That's kind of a necessary choice that we have to make. So what Paul has to do, and this is going to be very difficult, he's got to satisfy that fundamentalist need to find the roots of things. But he also has to give people the courage to blossom. Fundamentalism is when religion caves in on itself and it tries to live in the roots, and there's no fruit, much less flowers, and there's no seed for the future. So what Jesus said and what Paul is saying is that we have to find the courage to give birth to love. And the roots are important, but they're only important because we grow out of them to produce this fruit that he's going to talk about. Now, to do this, Paul is going to try to use philosophy on people, or theology on people. And he's going to distinguish between the flesh and the spirit. It's very important not to hear this as the body is bad, the spirit is good, because that's not what Paul is saying. Paul does not criticize the body. Paul uses a different word for the body, and at one point says that's the temple, your temple. So your body is not bad. Your needs are not bad. Your instincts are not bad. He uses a special word called flesh when we get stuck in the roots. We want everything to be something we can taste, touch, see, feel. And we just regress, and we're not loving, we're not kind. Spirit is not in the Jewish tradition, something has to be supernatural. It's more, the focus is less on this kind of freakish Greek idea of something that's not physical. It's more on the interpersonal, the interwovenness of things. The Spirit is kind of how things flow together. So what he's going to say is that living religion begins with the roots, but it has to transcend the roots. If you have love, you don't need the rules in the same way. If you get confused, you may want to go back to them and look again. But paint by numbers isn't really art. And just putting one foot before the other isn't really dancing. So to be really alive and loving, we have to come from the roots, but we have to go beyond that kind of fundamentalism that gets us started. I love that Paul is using the image of fruit. That's important to realize that he's using one word there. And that's important for Paul. Paul uses one word for sin. It's not sins. It's a disorientation. So when he talks about sin, he talks about it in the singular. But when he talks about the fruit, the blossoming of the Spirit of love, he uses one word too. So when you look at the list that he's going to give, he has 9, sometimes called fruits of the Spirit. But it's not like lifesavers where you have each different fruits and you're trying to collect all the different types of fruit. It's saying that when you're coming from your roots, when you're expressing yourself in love, then your life will have certain qualities. If you're stuck in your passions, if you're stuck in your instincts and your habits and your habituations, then he does a list of what he calls what proceeds from the flesh, the works of the flesh. And he always starts with the sexual things first, because that's what the fundamentalists are most focused on. So he talks about lewd conduct, impurity, licentiousness. It goes on like that. But then he talks about anger, rivalries, dissensions, factions, and he just keeps hitting on that theme, that it's when religion divides us, when it's trying to get back to a world that never was. And what he's going to say is, you can tell in your heart whether you're producing bitterness and pain and ugliness. Are these fruits of the Spirit? There's 9 of them, and we obviously can't do justice to that. What we'll do someday is take each one of these words, because a lot of the words are very rich in the Stoic tradition, and we could spend a sermon on each one. Someday we will. So he says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patient endurance, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. He's saying that's what it's going to feel like when you're on the right path. That those qualities will emerge from, they won't come fully born. Fruit has to grow. So he's saying you can expect this to happen through you. This isn't something you have to make happen. So he's using a kind of organic quality. I love that joy is so high up on the list. Because a lot of times when we look at Paul or we look at ethics, we get kind of moody. And he's saying that joy will be one of the signs, not necessarily happiness. And that's what makes each of these virtues, the Stoic virtues that he's going to list. Usually, if we're going to learn them, we learn them in times of problems, in chaotic times like the ones that we're going through. And when you're going to learn joy, you do it through disappointments. Happiness you can just find from time to time, but joy, which is a quality of the Spirit, which is the quality of the life of love, is something that you start finding a happiness that's deeper than what happens to you. Billy Sunday used to say, If you have no joy, there's a leak in your Christianity somewhere. So one of the signs that we're on the right path is not necessarily happiness, but a kind of a gentle joy that starts percolating up. But it begins with our problems. And then he talks about patience. And again, this is a word we could spend a whole sermon on. It's more like patient endurance. It's when a runner slows down to pace themselves to win a race. It's not just patience, like waiting. It's strategic waiting. And the only place we can learn that kind of patience is with frustrations. When we're surrounded by frustrations, when we can't get in control of things, the very place we're in right now, that is a wonderful time to learn the acceptance of what we can't control. That famous, it was the best of times, worst of times. Usually the worst times for us personally are the best times to learn the deep wisdom truths of the world. I'm not saying that it's worth it, that COVID is a monstrosity. And if we could wish it away, I would be the first in line to do that. But since it's here and since we can't get out of it, why not learn these lessons? He talks about gentleness. And this is a word that we ran across a few weeks back where Jesus says his yoke is easy. The word means gentle, kind, easy, mellow. It's what happens to wine when it mellows, when shoes get, comfortable. So it's not repressing your feelings, but living long enough for them to mellow. Where the hurts, you feel them, but they don't define who you are or what your life means. And finally, he talks about empowerment. And if you look at much of the news these days, you feel powerless, you feel triggered, you feel reactionary to what's happening. And I think that's a time to step back a little bit, because love isn't like that. Love has a power to it, and it has a peace to it, so that other people don't just trigger us when we're in that place. I love this idea of the fruit. It's saying this is something natural. This isn't something artificial that you have to manufacture. It's saying that when you bring love to the problems of living, when you bring love to your loneliness, when you bring love to your despair, when you bring love to your frustration, all of those things can be the births, the beginnings and the birthplace of the great virtues. And together they help us experience joy and peace and love. Another reason I love the idea of fruit is that these things unfold. It's so frustrating to go out looking for wisdom. This is saying it's going to be born through you, and it's going to it'll look like a problem when it starts off very often. It'll look like an inadequacy that you have. It'll look like a flaw that you have. But when you bathe it in love, it'll be transformed, just like fruit is transformed over time. And I love the idea that fruit is seasonal. So when you're too tired, you're not expected to give fruit. No tree gives fruit 365 days a year, that you have to pace yourself. And sometimes when you feel like really lazy, that's actually your wisdom, that's saying, I'm going to rest so I'll be more fruitful down the road. And if I give my fruit now, it's not going to be sweet anyway. It'll be bitter. So do you have permission to be a human being, to give only the gifts, the type of fruit that you have to give, that feels like a gift, that feels rewarding, that fills you with peace and joy? So what Paul is saying, I think, is we can't always find the way to love through the rules. A better path is to look at what we're doing is doing to our heart. Is it making us peaceful? Is it making us kind? Is it making us more loving? And the reason that gives us hope, again, this image of the fruit, it's like there's a seed in there. The purpose of the fruit is tied up in the seed, what you're offering to the future through these virtues. I love the saying, you can count the seeds in an apple, but you can't count the apples in a seed. You can count the seeds in an apple, but you can't count the apples in a seed. That spiritual worth is different than physical worth. And the rules of the body, do this, don't do that. Eat this, don't eat that. Touch this, don't touch that. Paul is saying we can do better than that. That's just the cradle that gets us started. So when we look at the world that's falling apart all around us, this has happened to humankind so many times through the ages. And those are the times when great wisdom and great compassion have been born. This is a time when you can choose great wisdom and great compassion to live those out. And no matter what is happening, you can still shine the light that is within you and give the gift that you have to give. So instead of looking at the rule books or listening to a preacher, ask the question, what is your lifestyle doing to your heart? Is it making you angry and divisive and bitter? Or is it making you joyful, loving, peaceful, patient, and kind? I think Paul is giving us really helpful advice in this really painful time. He's reminding us what love can do to our problems and to our flaws, how these things can be transformed into a great gift to ourselves and to the world. And that's what gives us hope, knowing that while we can't, we can count the seeds in an apple, we can't count the apples in a seed. The gifts you give the world are beyond measure. So remembering in this time, you are the light of the world. Don't let anything put that light out. Well, these are my thoughts on Paul's words. We now take 60 seconds for you to think about your own words.
Hey, y'all.